Right, this is part 2 of the lecture, so you've listened to part 1 and now you're moving on to part 2. Excellent. Next slide. Lies we tell. And I surprised you there with a different color. Do you love these slides? They're really pretty, aren't they? Anyway, the Midwife's Tale counters a number of historical inaccuracies or myths about the American past. So that's a super polite way of saying Americans lie about the past. Historical inaccuracies is a polite way of saying lies. Myths is a polite way of saying lies. At least in this context. A myth is also a story we tell that can be not a lie, like creation myths, how the earth was made and stuff. But in this sense, in this lecture, we're going to call them myths because I decided to. How about that? You okay? Yeah. Next slide. Okay, so now we're looking at the myth. Anyway, myth number 1. This is lies we tell about the American past, and you hear this a lot. In the past, there was a lot less rape. Now, people don't come out and say it, but there's an assumption that rape is a modern problem, and it's not. Indeed, it says there, yeah, sure. Yeah, there was plenty of rape in the past. Indeed, I would argue there was much rape or more in the past. The difference was in the present, sometimes, occasionally, rapists are punished. In the past, I suspect they were, not suspect, I know, they were rarely punished. So the idea here is that modern women, by their behavior, have caused the violence against them and maybe even deserve it. This notion that, bitches, you wouldn't get raped if you weren't out at night, or you weren't going off to school, or you weren't going off to jobs, and you weren't wearing those short skirts, or you weren't wearing a shirt with a V-neck and I could see your cleavage. That rape is something that modern women, by their non-submissive, non-oppressed behavior, something they've earned. And I'm not saying I believe, obviously I'm not saying I believe this. I'm not even saying that everybody listening to this believes that, but you'll hear this idea out there that there's this magical moment in the past where there wasn't so much rape because the bitches knew their place. And that's super distressing. The reality is, remember our first lecture, we talked about patriarchy, and one of the things patriarchy gives you is it gives you rape culture. It does ipso facto, because patriarchy and coverture together say women aren't really people. They belong to men, and that men can do anything they want to it. And I don't mean all men. Clearly, all men aren't rapists. And this is no fun. I'm sorry, it's no fun at all. But some are, and that's what patriarchy gives you. There's always been rape. There's gonna be rape forever until we get over this patriarchal nonsense. And even then, there'll still be rape because there'll always be assholes. Right? Next slide. That was depressing. Violence in the past. Oh, this is way more fun than rape. The beating of women and children. No, there was plenty of violence, domestic violence in the past. Indeed, I'm completely comfortable arguing there was more domestic violence in the past because now our notion is that's wrong. You're not supposed to beat your wife or your husband, I guess, but certainly, and you're not supposed to beat your children. So there may be less of it these days because people are like, that's just wrong. Or there's just as much of it and it's more secretive, and I suspect that's what it is. Again, patriarchy tells the men that they are heads of families, and some of them take that to mean I can do anything I want to the people in my family. And some of you listening to this know exactly what I mean. And for that, I'm deeply sorry. That sucks. So what we have in Martha's world is tons of violence, not just violence against women, but a ton of violence against children. Um, um, Jonathan beats his kid, and he gets drunk and beats his kid. Captain Parrington kills his whole family. He didn't just wake up one day and kill his family. He probably abused them for years before he got around to putting them out of their misery and killing them. There's a ton of... in the very beginning of the video, they say that Captain Brown was arrested for raping his daughter. There's a ton of domestic violence, and it's taken kind of casually. This is just the way this stuff goes. But you'll hear this myth that somehow in the past this didn't used to be a problem. Again, the assumption, usually by sort of right-wing religious or political people, this sort of notion that women and children earn this violence because modern women and children are insufficiently submissive to men, we're bad, that we don't, we're going out and get jobs, the kids are off doing this and that the victims of violence earned it by being inappropriately submissive to the patriarchy. And that's nonsense. Just straight up nonsense. Nonsense! Anyway, next slide. In the past, politicians were way less corrupt. You hear this all the time, that somehow, like, Trump invented corruption. Or, I'm not going to vote because the politicians are also corrupt, so it's okay that I'm lazy and I don't participate in democracy. Oh, bite me. Politicians have always been corrupt. Not all of them, but some of them. Always. Here's the thing. Churchill said this a long time ago. He said, democracy is a terrible form of government, but all the other ones are worse. I don't think that's quite the quote, but it's something like that. Anyway, so one, this notion that you're going to opt out of democracy because some of the politicians are corrupt is ridiculous. And two, built into this is a notion that somehow that's a modern phenomenon, and it's not. There's no magical time in the American past where all the politicians, or like all the founding fathers, were super moral, super decent people. But again, this is another one of those myths that suggests that maybe the men in the past were better because the women and the people of color knew their place. Yeah, no. Keep in mind two things. One, more than half of the founding fathers, like Jefferson and a bunch of the rest of them, George Washington, were slave owners, which I'm pretty sure is immoral. And let's keep in mind that slavery isn't just immoral, but that slave owners are super likely to sexually abuse their female slaves, because that's what happens when you put men in complete control of the female body. Also, in the video, we saw the judge, who's a politician, going out, not just raping the minister's wife, but he'd been probably raping other people. You don't just wake up one day and rape the minister's wife, right? And then when you get away with it, you don't stop. But also, she wasn't just raped, she was gang raped. And who do you think was in his rape gang? Well, his friends. And who were his friends? Other powerful men. Which is probably why Martha opted out of religion and began thinking about God differently, because she thought, if a male God will let men do this, then I want no part of that. Again, I'm just guessing, but it's an informed guess based on all the things that I know about Martha Ballard, and that's a fair guess. Anyway, no time in the magical past where men in power, or people in power, were magically good. No, never. Next slide. Oh, you sluts, you whores, all of you. Oh, I'm so ashamed. There's this weird American myth that people in the past had a lot less sex and a lot less premarital sex, and that somehow now everybody running around sexing it up all the time is really bad. And we use this often to blame young people for being young people, which is pretty ridiculous if you ask me. And I guess you did by opening up this video. So this myth about there being a lot less premarital sex in the past is nonsense. There's tons of premarital sex in Martha's world. Indeed, they kind of don't care about it. Here's the thing, and this one's going to take a little bit longer than some of the other slides, but the reality is all cultures have rules about sex. And the reason all cultures have rules about sex isn't because sex is dirty or wrong. And it is if you do it right. My sex joke. But because sex leads to babies. And so all cultures have rules about sex because all cultures have to have rules about who takes care of the babies. Because babies born to just a mother all alone, are very likely to become burdens on a society. In a world where people died routinely young, because of course we all die routinely, but when people died routinely, a child with only one caretaker is very likely to become an orphan and thus a burden on the society. So the rules about sex are designed to make sure that children have a parent and then at least one backup parent. And in our culture, the parent is usually the mom and the dad is the backup parent. Not always, but usually. And let's be super honest about this, okay? Um, so in Martha Ballard's world, people could have all the sex they wanted, but if they got pregnant, then they had to get married. Now we've guaranteed that the child has a parent and a backup parent. What will happen in the American Revolution is the American Revolution will also bring us the westward expansion and the railroad and cities, industrialization, and in that world that gets bigger, it means men can leave. That when Sally Pierce or somebody like Sally Pierce gets pregnant and the Jonathan, the dad, doesn't want to marry her, he can disappear. He can go to New York City. He can get on a train and go west. He can disappear, leaving that woman and the pregnancy or the baby a single parent. So when that happens, when the American Revolution comes and it's possible for people to disappear, to leave, then the society changes the rules about sex. And we'll talk about that next week, but the short answer is they say you can't have it until you get married. And then the notion is now that you're married, you can have sex, and now you've got two babies. Now, the flaw with that rule is men can still leave, but married men, there's a certain amount of stability there that not being married doesn't provide. So, there you have it. So the rules, and the reason that colonial America doesn't care if people have sex, because where are the Jonathans going to go? He has to hang around that little town with his parents because he's planning on inheriting his father's farm. He can't go. He can't leave. And it's a small community where everybody knows each other, so they can pressure him to marry Sally. Indeed, there's a rule that says if Sally testifies while she's in labor that Jonathan is the father, she can actually take him to court and force him to marry her, because that's how seriously they take this. So that's the deal. Plenty of premarital sex, but lots of rules about getting married. All right, next slide. Oh, this is another one you hear all the time. People used to be a lot more religious in the past, in the good old days, when everybody believed in Jesus. And then, of course, this going to church made people better because all Christians are good people. I'm not being snotty here. Well, I'm being a little snotty here. The world's full of good Christians, but the world's also full of bad Christians because Christians be people. People are good and bad. Also, it's not true that there's a magical time in the American past where all the Americans were Protestants and all the Americans believed in God and Jesus in a Christian sense, and all the Americans went to church every day and did what their minister said. There's no such magical American past. And the religious right would have you believe it's so, and they're banking on the fact that you don't know enough American history to know they're lying. And they may also themselves not know enough American history to know they're lying. Also, I'm not sure many of those people are very uncomfortable with lying. But nonetheless, we always say this is a Christian nation and it was founded as a Christian nation. And I'm going to tell you, you might wish that to be true, but it's not. It's bullshit. Most of our founding fathers were deists or atheists. And you know what an atheist is? Somebody who doesn't believe in anything at all. And a bunch of our founding fathers were atheists. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Tom Paine, all atheists. A bunch more of our founding fathers were deists. A deist is somebody who believes in God, but not religion. George Washington was a deist. So was Sam Adams. As they believed in God and some great, powerful divine, but they thought organized religion was super dangerous. And this is sort of the generations after the Puritan church running amok, beating God over the head with people, hanging witches, etc., etc. You could see why there'd be a whole generation of people really skeptical about the church, if not God. And then there's Martha, who seemed to believe in the maternal or feminine divine. And you can bet that if Martha believed in a maternal or feminine divine, that some other women or even men may have too. That is, there's as much religious diversity out there in America then as there is now. And this is super important. I'm going to say it one more time. This nation was not founded by Christians to be a Christian nation. It was not. And indeed, it was designed purposely to keep religion out of the government. The founding fathers were super clear when they laid out a constitution that they didn't want any religion in the government. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. And if that's disappointing to you, I'm sorry, but it should be good news because if you keep religion out of the government, like I talked about last week, you also keep the government out of your religion. And if you're a religious person who takes that seriously, you would want that. You would not want me telling you how to believe. Okay, good? Yeah. Next slide. Last one, and it's my personal favorite. In the past, we took care of our elders. We respected them and we lived all together. All of us took care of Grandma and Grandpa. What we really mean there is the women took care of Grandma and Grandpa because we don't ever expect the men to stay home and do that. And I'm not saying there's no guys who are ever going to do that, but we really still understand that taking care of the home and the people in it is women's jobs, right? So let's be honest about that too. So we often imagine there's some magical past where we all lived in these big extended families and Grandma and Grandpa were had all this respect and they got the best chairs in the house and everybody sat around their feet and listened to them tell stories because Grandma and Grandpa were so important. Remember the Martha Ballard video? You just saw it, didn't you? How was that for her to be old? Not that great, was it? Remember her out there hacking at the fence all by herself? Yeah, this is a world with no. There's no safety net for old people in Martha Ballard's world. Oh, also remember the old man witches? Remember with the lecture? Old men were way more likely to be convicted of witchcraft. Why? Because they didn't need them. They were useless. So it is a world that not only doesn't respect old people, but there's no safety net for old people. You and I live in a world with Social Security, 401ks, old folks' homes, retirement centers, extended care places, home health visiting nurses, all this stuff. All this stuff. I always say, there's Mamie again, being very angry. What I always say is, I don't expect you, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years from now, I don't expect you to remember all these details. I expect you to remember them for a little while because, you're not retards. But I also, I think you should get the big point should maybe stick with you. That is, the next time you hear one of these golden age myths, you hear somebody sort of reference the point that there was some magical past where people didn't do fill in the blank. Um, you should think, wait a second, didn't I learn that was bullshit? That is, if all of these things we just talked about are nonsense, then maybe the thing that somebody's talking about now is also nonsense. So the point is, when you hear this new thing about some golden age, you should be able to ask yourself, is that true? And what if it's not? What if it's not true? Why would this person lie? Why would this person tell this golden age myth about America? Who is this person trying to blame? Who is this person trying to demonize? What is this person's agenda? Because my experience is these golden age myths always have an agenda. It tends to be socially conservative. That is an agenda, and I'm not talking about politics or redness or blueness or any of that, but just the agenda tends to be sort of the control of women, the control of people of color, the control of young people, the control of anybody with less power than the person who's telling you this nonsense. That's what I want out of this lecture is I want you to take forward, even when you've forgotten Martha Ballard, this notion that there's no time in the magical past where things were better, and that people who say so are doing so for some particular agenda, political agenda. And I don't mean, again, politics in the Republican and Democrat sense, politics in the sense of who has power and who doesn't have power. That is, they want you to think, damn it. That's why you went to college. That's why you're doing this now. You're not really, it doesn't really matter. Any of these details I'm teaching you don't really matter. They don't. What matters is you're doing push ups for your brain. You're learning to think. I want you to think. I want you to go out there and I want you to think. I want you to think hard. I want you to think about everything. I don't want you to be a sheep. I won't want you to be a toilet paper hoarder and a panicker and to throw your arms up in the air and think about yourself and not take care of anybody else. Mindless sheep. Even sheep don't do that. Sheep take care of each other. I want you to think. I want you to care. I want you to clock in. Because ideas matter, don't they? They do. Okay, hold on. Last slide. Doing your work. Hey, if you got this far, so you've watched the Martha Ballard thing and you've watched through this slide, you've done your week 5 work, you've done it all by yourself without coming to class and having me herd you through it. And if you think that's not an achievement, you're not giving yourself enough credit. That's a big achievement, so good on you. I'm really proud of you. This is really great. Keep in mind, if you have any questions about this lecture or anything in general, keep emailing me. I don't mind answering my email. I'm cashing my checks. In a time when lots of Americans aren't going to work, I'm still getting paid. And so I'm glad to help you. I would be glad to help you even if I wasn't getting paid. But let's be honest, the state's paying me to help you. So if you have any questions, you email me. And just keep looking for stuff, keep doing your work, and at the end, we'll have all had a meaningful, I think, learning experience. And that was the point, right? Not as fun as if we'd been in class together, but better than a poke in the nose, right? That's it for this week. Spread the love. Don't forget to do a little bit of naughty stuff so you have fun. Miss you. Bye.